In the previous video, we looked briefly at the role of the frontal lobe, but there are three other lobes that contribute to human functioning. One of these is the parietal lobe. As you can see, the parietal lobe sits behind the frontal lobe, in front of the occipital lobe and above the temporal lobe. It is responsible for functions such as spatial perception, processing touch, and mental arithmetic. Damage to the parietal lobe, usually the right parietal lobe, may result in a condition called spatial neglect, where affected individuals continuously ignore stimuli presented from one side of the body. But we will look into spatial neglect later in the course. Just as the frontal lobe includes the primary motor cortex, the parietal lobe includes the primary somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is basically a mirror image of the primary motor cortex, with the mirror being the central fissure. So it looks a bit like this. The primary somatosensory cortex is responsible for receiving sensory information from parts of the body. That means that when we process pressure, pain, or temperature, the primary somatosensory cortex is at work. If you put your left hand on a very hot stove, for example, the extreme heat would be processed in the right primary somatosensory cortex. The right primary motor cortex would then be responsible for moving your left hand away from the stove. So remember, the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe is responsible for movement, whilst the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe is responsible for processing sensations. As a bit of light revision, try answering this multiple choice question from the 2008 VCE exam. Does the parietal lobe contain A, the motor cortex, B, the somatosensory cortex, C, Broca's area, or D, Wernicke's area? If you've been paying attention, this should be pretty easy. But think of it this way, you just learnt the answer to an exam question. Next up, we have the temporal lobe. Keep working hard, psych students.